Good evening, everyone. And thank you for coming out tonight. We're very excited to have everyone here for the 5th lecture in our Vietnam series. So far, we've talked about how it all began, the Army in Vietnam, the Army nurses in Vietnam, the Coast Guard in Vietnam, and tonight we're proud to have the Air Force in Vietnam. If you've missed any of our lectures or you have friends that would be interested in seeing any of our lectures that we've already had, please refer them to our website. And from our website, you can go to our YouTube channel, and all of our previous lectures are posted there, as well as on Facebook. As we begin all of our programs here at the Silversides, if you are capable, I please ask that you rise and join us in saying the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you all for joining us, whether you were here or you were at home on Zoom. We appreciate that. The USS Silversides is very happy to offer the lecture series that we do here, and we do it through the kind, generous donations of many of our supporters to the museum. As all of you know that are present, the USS Silversides does not receive any state, federal, or local funding. All of our programming and all of our preservation work is done through the kind, generous donations of our community and through admissions and gift shop sales. So we thank you for that. Tonight's series sponsor is the Lorraine and Fred Birch Jr. Foundation. They are a wonderful couple that began in Holland. They both met during World War II, and they both served. After returning from their deployments, they both went into careers in public service, and they felt that public service is one of the most important things that you can do to your community, whether it be at the state, federal, or local level. And they believe that education, excuse me, is the key way to achieve your people's good support of public service and interactions in their community. They are the kind people through their children that have started this foundation and help support us here at the museum. So we appreciate them for all that they do for the museum. Our media sponsor is Blue Lake Public Radio. Blue Lake is an absolute gem in our community, and we appreciate all that they do for us. As I said earlier, this is the 5th in our Vietnam series, and it's absolutely amazing how much new information that I learn each and every evening that's here, that we talk about things. And I sometimes think the most important part, excuse me, is the dialogue that happens at the end of the conversation, at the end of the presentations. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them at the end of the presentation. Those of you that are on Zoom, at the end of the presentation, I will ask that you unmute your mics, and then you can ask those questions, and I'll be able to pass around the mic to anyone that's in the room that needs to be handed the mic. Next week's lecture is being presented by Fred Johnson, a familiar face here at the museum. Fred served in the Marines, and his father was actually in the military during Vietnam. And when Fred was a young man, he spent those years as a young man in the Philippines while his father was in service. And he has a wonderful presentation to discuss what the role of the Marines were in Vietnam. Tonight, we are extremely lucky and thrilled to have Dr. Brian Laslie, a professor from the United States Air Force Academy, who knows more about air power than anyone that I've read before and looked up, and I think it's going to be an absolutely amazing presentation. And so without further ado, I will turn the screen over to tonight's speaker. And those of you on Zoom, please remember to continue to keep your screens muted. And Dr. Laslie, I will turn the mic over to you.
All right, well, good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear and see me okay? Yes. If I could get at least a thumbs up from some of the audience members, that would be a big help. All right, yeah. Terrific. Thank you so much. And then give me just a second here to get my screen up. And then hopefully what everyone is now looking at, since you should be seeing the same thing I am, which is the cover of my most recent book called Air Power's Lost Cause, The American Air Wars of Vietnam. And so the presentation that I'm going to give you guys tonight is kind of a version of that book, but I'm going to specifically focus on the Air Force. The reason that I wrote this book, look, there are thousands of books about the air war in Vietnam. There's MiG killers, there's fighting on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, there's the linebacker missions, there's chronological studies. But what I wanted to do was in one short, 250 page book was cover everything that air power did in the Vietnam conflict. So that was my going in goal. And hopefully I did that. A little bit about me. As Peggy mentioned, I am at the United States Air Force Academy. I am an adjunct professor, but I am also the Academy's command historian. So my full-time job is to write and relate the history of the United States Air Force Academy. So as someone who is passionate about air power, as I often joke when I give talks in the local area, I have the best job in the United States Air Force. I spent 6 years active duty, got out to go to grad school at Kansas State University, which had a reputation for having a great military history program. I studied under a professor known for his air power prowess. And if you wonder why I decided to study, the history of airplanes, air power, space power, and what have you, it probably goes back to Tailspin. Someone asked me before we started the presentation what my favorite airplane was. I'd be lying if I was not to say if I was not heavily influenced by, Consolidated Catalinas, Grumman Albatross, Dauntless Dolphins, the beautiful seaplanes of the World War II era. But really, I think watching cartoons made me want to study airplanes. So the overview of the way I'm going to tackle this tonight, I don't know what everyone's experience is with reading about Vietnam, with studying about Vietnam, with seeing films from the era. So I'm going to do a quick timeline of major events just to kind of lay out what was going on. I'll go through, maps, units, aircraft, how everything was organized, how we conducted operations, and then I'll go into the aerial conflicts themselves. Now, the problem with Vietnam versus studying a lot of other historical air operations or just even other historical wars is it tends to get convoluted very quickly. There's the war in the South, what we typically call the in-country war. This is, a close air support conflict with Army and Marine troops on the ground. I'll talk about how things expand from there, how we end up going north into what we call the out-country war. And there I'll talk about the route packages, the divvying up of the country, the air-to-air conflict. I'll then move over to Laos and Cambodia because those are kind of separate aerial conflicts as well. And so what we were doing in those two countries in the air. And then I'll kind of end with what we call the strategic air wars. And while we can lump Rolling Thunder into that, principally I'll talk about Operation Linebacker 1 and Linebacker 2. So I've always found when discussing Vietnam that, dates are kind of fungible, and my answer to almost any question is typically it depends. So when did we get involved in Vietnam? Well, it depends on how far back you want to go, all the way to the post-World War II era. But for tonight, we're going to jump in about 1963 when President Kennedy's assassinated, and 3 weeks prior to that when South Vietnamese President Diem is assassinated, because that is really kind of the moment that things begin to shake loose and expand. Lyndon Johnson becomes president by August of 1964. We have the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and that is where we expand the air war to cover all of Vietnam. In fact, as part of the Gulf of Tonkin, the reprisal attacks after that, on August 5th, 1964, Lieutenant Junior Grade Alvarez of the United States Navy is shot down. He becomes the first prisoner of war. He is going to be held in various prisons, but principally the Hanoi Hilton, for the next 8 years and 6 months. He will subsequently be joined by over 500 other airmen, Marines, Navy, officer enlisted, who are going to be held in the POW camps of North Vietnam. Again, after the Gulf of Tonkin, we're going to get into Operation Rolling Thunder. That is the 3-year operation of bombing the North, which we will talk about. But in the process of that, we're going to lose nearly 1,000 aircraft. All right. So the question I try to answer there is the coercion that we were trying to do, did it work? I won't go through some of these others because they're going to kind of come up in turn. But let's jump all the way forward to March of 68, where Lyndon Johnson drops out and he stops Rolling Thunder. So after 1968, we are no longer bombing North Vietnam. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not bombing, because we're certainly dropping munitions in South Vietnam, and we never stop bombing along the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos and Cambodia. I don't need to go into any more detail about the horrible events of 1968, but look, it was not a good year. Eventually, Nixon's going to become president. He's going to resume the bombing of the North. In July of 69, obviously, we are going to land and walk on the moon for the first time. Again, think about the POWs who have been in prison since 65, 66, 67, and missed every phase of the Gemini and Apollo program. All right, moving on. By 1972, we're fully in to Vietnamization. We are trying to get American ground troops out, and in order to fill that void, we're going to use a lot of airstrikes and air power to bring our weapons to bear against North Vietnam. February of 72, this is actually kind of important. Nixon visits China, and what we begin to see in the early 1970s is Nixon successfully starts to separate the support of the Soviet Union and China from North Vietnam. So prior to that, there was always this fear that if we bombed too hard or too much, we were going to bring the Soviet Union and China into the war. By the early 1970s, we basically have assurances that that's no longer going to happen. So that gives the United States air arm a lot more leverage in going against North Vietnam. So in April of 72, we're going to attack Hanoi and Haiphong for the first time. And now we're into the home stretch with the Paris peace talks. And again, we'll get into linebacker 1, linebacker 2. We'll get into all of our combat troops departing Vietnam, and we'll get into the end of the war. But this timeline was just to give everyone kind of a snapshot of what was going on throughout the Vietnam conflict. So let's kind of set the stage here. And although we call it the Vietnam War, and after the wars ended, North Vietnam principally called it the American War. But let's kind of set the stage. It's a lot broader than just North and South Vietnam. It's going to include North Vietnam, South Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, and Thailand as well. So let's start going north to south. Obviously, you've got the capital of Hanoi up there at the top of your screen. To the east of Hanoi is the port city of Haiphong. And you'll also note China in the upper part of your screen. So most of North Vietnam's outside support, so the surface-to-air missiles, the MiG jets, a lot of weapons and munitions, they're going to come in by rail through China, or they're going to come in by sea into the port of Haiphong from the Soviet Union. Moving south, we come to, you'll see the Mugai Pass there, which is one of the entrance points for the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And you'll see that the trail runs north to south, and it goes all the way south to just north of Saigon. There are a lot of entrance points. There are a lot of exit points, but we'll get into that when we talk about Laos and Cambodia here in a little bit. So the little blue airplanes you see there, those are the principal air bases in South Vietnam and in Thailand. And I'll talk a little bit more in a little bit about the really complicated command and control that went on. So, you could be flying an American airplane out of an air base in Thailand, and you could not drop bombs in South Vietnam. You could be flying in South Vietnam and drop bombs in South Vietnam, or you could drop bombs in North Vietnam. But again, if you flew out of Thailand, you might not be able to come in on a close air support mission. Look, the rules of engagement were nothing short of extraordinarily complicated, and the American pilots flying these missions recognize this. So in South Vietnam, we've got Da Nang, we've got Pleiku, Phu Cat, Cam Ranh Bay, and then Bien Hoa right outside of Saigon. And these were not all, what we would say Air Force bases. Some Navy aircraft flew out of there. A lot of Marine aircraft flew out of some of these bases. And then over in Thailand, principally fighter and reconnaissance bases. So Udorn, Ubon, Karat, Tak Lee, Utapao actually had B-52. So if you look at Bangkok there and go south, Utapao was one of our principal bomber bases. And I'll go over the exact type of aircraft that we had flying out of these bases here in a little bit. But this is just kind of a scene setter, kind of give you the lay of the land. All right, this is a difficult slide to see. And don't adjust your eyeglasses. It's blurry to me too. But what I want to show you here is command and control in relationships. So really the easiest way to do this is just to look at the bottom of the chart. And what you'll notice is you will see 7th Air Force. You'll see 7th Air Force again. You'll see the MACV, which is the Military Assistance Command for Vietnam. But if you think of 7th Air Force as Air Force assets, and then over on the left side, Task Force 77 as Navy assets, you'll note that there was not one person, one air commander who could tell all of the airplanes what to do. And in fact, at any given time, there were 3, if not 4 air commanders. The Strategic Air Command did not want to give up control of the B-52s. So the B-52s remained under the command of Strategic Air Command. Air Force assets remained under the command of the commander of 7th Air Force. Navy assets remained under PAC Fleet and Task Force 77. Yeah, we did have an air coordinating committee, but that was about all they could do was kind of coordinate. So if you move forward to something like Desert Storm or Operation Iraqi Freedom, where you have an overall commander of all assets, and he has one air commander who is responsible for executing all air missions. We did not have that in Vietnam. We had 2, 3, sometimes 4 different people who could order airplanes around. Again, convoluted, confusing, in no way to run a railroad. All right, this slide should give you a little bit clearer since we're principally talking about Air Force assets tonight. And all this really does is you can see over on the right side of your screen, those are the Thailand bases. And then kind of in the center of your screen, those are the South Vietnam bases. And this is just to let you know, kind of at the height of operations in 1969, you'll see we've got a bunch of fighter wings. We've got special operations wings. We've got airlift. We've got combat search and rescue. We've got weather groups. And then again, over in Thailand, we've got another group of fighter wings over there as well. So all sorts of different types of Air Force assets operating in both South Vietnam and Thailand. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the war itself. All right, there's really no good date to say this is when the air war in Vietnam started. By the late 1950s, early 1960s, we have men and aircraft in South Vietnam, and their job is to train the South Vietnamese Air Force. In fact, any mission that flew from 1961 to about 1964 was supposed to have a South Vietnamese Air Force officer in the aircraft. Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force at the time in 61 and 62 was Curtis LeMay. And LeMay was quoted as saying, look, it was confusing. We had aircraft with U.S. Air Force colors. We had aircraft with South Vietnamese Air Force colors. We had aircraft that had American crews and South Vietnamese crews. We had all South Vietnamese. We had all Air Force. It never worked out the way it was supposed to. But the important thing about the war in the South is that between 1961 and 1964, there were no jet aircraft. All right. And although we consider these the principal bombing and attack aircraft of the war, early in the war, 61 to about 64, the Geneva Conventions preclude us from using jet aircraft. After the Gulf of Tonkin, that's going to kind of go out the window as the war expands. Now, through history, memory, and film, the war in South Vietnam, I think, in my perception, tends to be the most recognizable to us. This is what the movies Hamburger Hill, We Were Soldiers, Full Metal Jacket, anything that really shows American troops on the ground, that's the in-country war of South Vietnam. Now that's gonna run from let's say 61, and it's gonna run until the last American troops leave South Vietnam in about 1971, 1972. And so what does the Air Force itself do in South Vietnam in the in-country war? It's principally a close air support war. So when I say close air support, I am talking about Army and Marine troops on the ground, and the Air Force, and obviously, Navy and Marine Corps, but since we're talking Air Force tonight, providing close air support to those troops in contact on the ground. Again, that was everything from, we'll see pictures of these aircraft later, from propeller-driven A-1 Sky Raiders to, if you look at that picture on the right there, those are Marines on the ground at Khe Sanh, and you see that little blip in the sky, that's an F-4 providing close air support. So I think the war in South Vietnam tends to be more recognizable to us. It tends to be the one we see in films made about the Vietnam conflict more often. And it's because of that support that we gave to the troops on the ground. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of Army operations that go on in South Vietnam. Silver Bayonet, Cedar Falls, Junction City, Operation Niagara at Khe Sanh. All of these are missions that the Air Force uses to support our troops on the ground. Obviously, even though we're talking Air Force tonight, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that I consider the UH-1 Huey there in your left-hand picture probably the most ubiquitous and recognizable aircraft of the Vietnam conflict. And we've all seen it, dropping troops into fields in South Vietnam. And so that was kind of the Army's use of air power in Vietnam as well. So I won't steal anyone else's thunder there, but I would be remiss if I did not mention the Huey there. So that's what goes on in South Vietnam. All right. So August of 1964, we have two American destroyers that are operating in the Gulf of Tonkin. And let's be honest, they're out there on intelligence gathering missions. And we have the Gulf of Tonkin incidents that take place on August 2nd and August 4th. We are, through the historical record, pretty sure that the August 2nd incident did occur. There were North Vietnam torpedo boats. There are photographs of them. We have the radio chatter. August 4th is a lot more murky. In fact, one of the American pilots who was sent to find the boats on August 4th, James Stockdale, who would later become one of the principal resistance leader as a POW, said that there were absolutely no boats out there on August 4th. Be that as it may, we end up with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. We end up with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And that means that we are going to have a massive expansion in the Vietnam conflict. And you'll have to forgive me here as I pause every so often to get a sip of water. One of the important things that occurs after Gulf of Tonkin resolution is the introduction of jets into the conflict. So this is, saying that the gloves come off is just not historically accurate. But after Tonkin Gulf, we are a lot more willing to use Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps jet aircraft throughout the country. So this is really when I would consider the introduction of jets and the massive expansion of the war to begin. So let's talk about the different Air Force aircraft that were used in Vietnam. Look, this is not a comprehensive list. I would say that what you're looking at here are probably, the principal aircraft or the most well-remembered aircraft. But I can tell you that this is not a comprehensive list, nor is it meant to be. It's just to give you an idea of the various types of aircraft that we had operating in Vietnam. So if we want to start on the left side of the screen, we've got the F-4 Phantom used by both the Navy and the Air Force. Principally, it was designed to be a Navy aircraft that was to be used for fleet defense. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara more or less forced the Air Force into taking the aircraft. And then throughout the Vietnam War, it is kind of a jack of all trades. I mentioned the Navy used it as well. It's used in an air-to-air role. It's used in an air-to-ground attack role. It's used in a photo reconnaissance role. It does a little bit of everything. Right below that is the F-105 Thunder Chief, affectionately known as the Thud to the guys who flew it and the guys who worked on it. It was principally designed to be an aircraft used by the Air Force for the delivery of nuclear weapons in the event of a war with the Soviet Union. So it was meant to deliver tactical nuclear weapons. Obviously, that's not what it's going to do in North and South Vietnam. It's principally going to be a bombing aircraft that is going to attack targets throughout Rolling Thunder. Of every F-105 ever produced, we lose about half of them in Vietnam. So I forget the numbers, but it's along the line of 800 to 900 F-105s are produced. And we're going to lose about 400 of them in the Vietnam conflict to give you an idea of the losses that we suffer in the air-to-air war and in the air-to-ground war. Below that, another one of my favorite aircraft. This is the F-100 Super Sabre. Doesn't get as much love as the F-4 and F-105, but used in Vietnam almost as a type of reconnaissance. The Misty Fast Facts fly these. So the Ford air controllers who are out looking for targets on the on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Going back to the center column now, we've got the HH-3 Jolly Green for combat search and rescue. In the middle of your screen also doesn't get a lot of love. The B-57, which is a two-seat medium bomber. And of course, at the bottom of the screen, we are all familiar with the strategic bomber, the B-52. Obviously, a lot more on him here in a little bit. Then you got the Bird Dog. These are your slow facts, your slow forward air controllers out there marking targets. You got your A-1 Sky Raiders, which are principally used for really close-in air support missions in the South, but also used in conjunction with those HH-3 helicopters to provide support when going in and trying to pick up downed airmen. And then again, I'd be remiss if I did not mention the one of the early gunships, the AC-47 there. So again, what is the Air Force operating in Vietnam after 1964? We've got fighters, we've got medium bombers, we've got heavy bombers, we've got jets, we've got propeller-driven aircraft. We've got it all. What you have here is an Air Force inventory designed to be used against the Soviet Union in Western Europe. And we're going to have to kind of change these tactics on the fly to go in a much more conventional war against North Vietnam. All right, so let's talk about it. Once the war expands after Gulf of Tonkin, we are going to start Rolling Thunder. Hey, look, for anyone in the audience, I know those are Navy aircraft over there. I know that those are A6 intruders on the deck of an aircraft carrier. But there's only so much I was going to change the presentation. And besides, I like the A6, so he got to stay. And he's important for another reason. When we start bombing in North Vietnam as part of Rolling Thunder, and Rolling Thunder is what we typically call air power and coercion. We're trying to send a message to North Vietnam that they better stop what they're doing, which is supporting the insurgency in South Vietnam. The problem is we never do this very well. We do it in kind of a haphazard manner. We do, from a certain point of view, kind of tie one hand behind our back. If you look at the map of North Vietnam there, you'll see the very famous route packs, all right, or route packages. Or what the pilots are going to refer to as RP1 through RP6B. They basically divide the country of North Vietnam up into 7 different areas, and this says who can bomb where. So they're divided up equally between the Air Force and the Navy. And depending on where you flew in those route packages, that also depended upon what type of enemy defenses you were going to fly against, but more on that here in a second. But what I want to mention here is that if you look at 6A and 6B, you'll notice the red circle, all right? Clearly an off-limits area, that's the city of Hanoi. You could not, throughout most of the war, not all of the war, but you could not, throughout most of the war, enter that 20-mile circle around North Vietnam. You could not enter that 10-mile circle around Haiphong over on the coast. You also could not enter a 5-mile boundary area along the border with China. All right. I'll give you 3 guesses where North Vietnam kept the bulk of their supplies. It's in these off-limits areas, right? It's very hard to conduct a war. We typically talk of like industrial bombing in the Air Force. It's very hard to conduct a war when you cross off a lot of the industrial areas and are not allowed to bomb them. Again, notice that the Army and the Navy are not working closely together. In fact, they're often at competition with one another. And again, no way to run a conflict. So once we start Rolling Thunder and once we start bombing operations in the north, what do those defenses look like during Rolling Thunder? Well, we're going to get to that in just a second, but let's talk for just a minute here. We tend to talk about these, air engagements or bombing engagements kind of in medias res, right? But man, there's a lot that goes into attacking a target in North Vietnam. If you are in Thailand, let's say at Korat or Udon or Ubon, if you're in the early go, you're going to get up, you're going to have breakfast. You're going to go to your morning briefing. That's where you're going to get what's the weather over the target, what's the intelligence, what kind of threats are you going to face. You're going to deconflict all the call signs so that you know who Chevy Flight is, Olds Flight, Misty Flight. You're going to get your bomb loads. You're going to get your bomb angles. You're going to get the KC-135 refueler that you've got to take off and go find and refuel you and all three of your wingman. You're going to get all that information. Then you're going to go put on all of your equipment, which is your flight, G-suit, helmet, parachute, all of your survival gear. You're going to go out to the aircraft. You're going to walk around it, pre-flight it. You're going to taxi. You're going to go to the arming area. They're going to pull the pins out of the bombs and missiles so that they work. You're going to take off, form up, do your comm check, do refueling, make your weapons hot. And now, after about 2 to 3 hours, now you're actually ready to ingress into North Vietnam to your bombing target. The North Vietnamese array perhaps the greatest at the time, short of going to Moscow, the greatest air defense on the planet is centered in North Vietnam. What we call an integrated air defense system, or IADS for short, is principally made up of three things: SAMs, anti-aircraft artillery, and MiGs. SAMs are surface-to-air missiles, what our pilots typically call flying telephone poles. The MiGs come in three varieties: the 17, the 19, and the 21. You're looking at a 19 and a 21 on your right-hand side there. They are flown by pilots who are trained by the Soviet Union and China. And I'm not going to lie to you, the North Vietnamese pilots are pretty darn good at what they do. The surface-to-air missile operators are pretty darn good at what they do. Now, there's a trick in this, in that the way to avoid the SAM missiles was to fly low and fast. Of course, if you flew low, you were going to come in range of the AAA. If you flew out of the range of the AAA, guess what? You were now in SAM territory. So flying in North Vietnam was very much a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. To give you an idea of what this air defense system looked at, the map on your left shows you where the MiGs could be at. They weren't necessarily always at these places. Kep and Phu Quien typically had MiGs at them, but these kind of moved around, all right? At any given time, North Vietnam only had about 120 MiGs divided up against the three categories I mentioned. If you're really into this stuff, typically the way we called out, MiGs 17, 19, and 21 were red MiGs, white MiGs, and blue MiGs. We also had green MiGs if someone really knew what they were doing out there. But they only had about 120 MiGs at any given time. In addition to those MiGs, what you see on that right, those group of circles, those are the SAM sites, all right? And those are the surface-to-air missiles. Note that they go all the way down almost to the DMZ, and then they're really clustered around Hanoi and Haiphong. To give you an idea of what we would face when going against targets in these areas. I'll tell you that the principal downer of American aircraft throughout Vietnam was not SAMs and it was not MiGs. It was the AAA. But again, in order to drop your bombs, you were going to have to be low enough to do that on a dive angle, sometimes flying at a fairly predictable rate and route. And so the biggest killer of American aircraft during the war was AAA. If you were shot down as an American, if you were shot down as an American in North Vietnam and you survived, if you ejected and survived, you were likely going to end up in one of the numerous prison camps around the city of Hanoi. the Zoo, the Briar Patch, but most certainly the Hanoi Hilton. All right. If you were shot down in North Vietnam, unless you were very near the coast, very far south, or very, very lucky, it was doubtful that you were going to get picked up. So I've talked about all of these surface-to-air missile sites. We kind of have to change tactics throughout the war. We've eventually got to go after these SAMs. And the way that we're going to go after the SAMs is by wild weasels. This is probably one of my favorite things to write about and to talk about, are the guys whose job it is to go out to get these SAM site, the radars, to tune into them, to lock onto them, and then to shoot missiles at them. And they do all of this so that the guy in the back seat here, in these two-seat F-100s and F-105s, can then use a radar homing beacon to kind of cue in on the enemy radar and then fire a anti-radiation missile at it. All right. And so this is a back and forth things that happen. The Vietnamese learn how to turn on and turn off their radars rapidly. Our guys learn how to take that 5 or 15 seconds to cue in and fire the harms. But this led to the Wild Weasel mission, and probably one of my all-time favorite patches or emblems is the YGBSM. And if you're curious what that stands for, you'll have to pardon my language, but it stands for "You've got to be shitting me." And so these were the guys whose mission it was to get the SAM radars and missiles to lock onto them. I talked for a minute about the MiGs. We came out of Vietnam with the last of the aces. To be an ace, you had to shoot down 5 or more aircraft. We were pretty evenly split between the Air Force and the Navy. Navy had 2, Air Force had 3. You'll note that we have 2 pilots and then some WIZOs and NFOs. Those were the backseaters. It was decided during the Vietnam conflict that the backseater who operated the missile systems would also get credit for an air-to-air kill. The Air Force was really not big on this until Randy Cunningham and Willie Driscoll became the first 2 aces, and suddenly the Air Force decided that the guys in the backseat of their F-4s could get credit for kills also. In the lower right there is Robin Olds. If you want to read an absolutely fascinating biography, I recommend Fighter Pilot by Robin and Christina Olds. This man was a fighter pilot's fighter pilot. In fact, we just unveiled a statue of him up here at the Air Force Academy. Now, I'll tell you, he only shot down 4 aircraft in the Vietnam conflict. All right, he only shot down 4. But that brought his total to 16. So he is indeed a triple ace, counting his kills in Europe during World War II. I say we had 5 aces. If you're curious about the Vietnamese, the People's Air Force, they had over 15 aces during the conflict. All right, I know I got to move along here because I want to leave time for questions and answers. So let me talk about Laos and Cambodia really quickly here. This was the Ho Chi Minh Trail, right? This was how North Vietnam moved men and material down through Laos, through Cambodia, and into South Vietnam to support the insurgency down there. And we spent the better part of a decade trying to interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The problem is the Ho Chi Minh Trail is not I-75, right? It's much more capillary than it is arterial, all right? So bombing it, attacking it through the barrel roll missions, the Steel Tiger missions, the menu missions later in the war was something we tried to do throughout the war. But, look, I'm of the opinion that even if we could have completely severed the Ho Chi Minh Trail and just picked up Laos and Cambodia and moved them out of the way, the insurgency in the South would have continued. They could get enough internally from South Vietnam that what was coming down the trail was important, but not entirely necessary. If you look at the two pictures on the right, you're going to see that Cambodia probably became the most bombed country in the history of the earth. Yes, more so than Europe in World War II. Yes, more so than Japan in World War II. We dropped more tons of bombs in Laos and Cambodia than we did in those other two conflicts. Of course, you got to remember by this time, a single F-4 carries the same bomb load as a B-17 did in World War II. All right, so let's go ahead and go forward to linebackers 1 and 2. After Nixon becomes president, after a little bit of détente, after a little bit of thaw, after visiting the Chinese, and more or less after getting assurances that China and the Soviet Union have no interest in and expanding the war, gave Nixon a lot more leeway in 1971 and 1972. Linebacker 1 was principally a mission used to try to bring the North Vietnamese to the bargaining table, and linebacker 2 was principally used to try to get the final peace treaty signed. After talks had stalled, linebacker 2 went into effect in December of 1972. And I find this to be a really interesting operation because typically the Air Force will tell you that linebacker 2 ended the war. What's really interesting is that the Vietnamese will tell you that, yeah, that's true, but they believe they won it. In fact, they call what we call linebacker 2, they call the Dien Bien Phu of the skies. So, they consider their two biggest victories to be Dien Bien Phu over the French, and then the Dien Bien Phu of the skies over the Americans. United States Air Force admitted to losing 15 B-52s during Operation Linebacker 2 for a number of reasons, but that does not count the somewhere between 6 and a dozen B-52s that sustained damage that made it back to Utapao or Guam but never flew again. But I will tell you, if Linebacker 2 did anything, it 100% guaranteed the release of more than 500 POWs. So I don't think that there is any way that you can say that that particular bombing operation was not a success. So, in 45, 50 minutes there, that's kind of everything that the Air Force did during the Vietnam conflict. Everywhere they attacked, all of the types of aircraft that they used. But again, 45 minutes to cover a decade, more than a decade of conflict. And there's so many things that I could have kept talking about or brought up. And so now I'm going to throw it open and hope you've got some questions for me.
I'll come around with the microphone so that our speaker can hear better. So anyone have a question? Okay, 1 second. Oh, and if Tom wants to run around with the mic, I appreciate that. Thank you, Tom.
Can you speak at all to the transportation, C-130s and stuff that the Air Force used to supply ground troops?
Yeah, so very, very important. And I really do appreciate you asking that question. In this conflict, especially, when you want to look at some of the operations in South Vietnam, like Khe Sanh, the Marines are only able to hold out at Khe Sanh thanks to aerial resupply by cargo aircraft. And that's either going to be done by parachuting supplies onto the airbase or by low extraction of material from the back of the aircraft as part of the LAPE system. But cargo aircraft, I know, and I discuss it a little bit in the book, but so very important. Obviously, in not only keeping men and material flowing into South Vietnam, but even more so keeping bases like Cam Duck, Khe Sanh, keeping them resupplied. And I am reminded that one of the Air Force's Medals of Honor during Vietnam was a C-119 pilot who landed under extremely heavy fire to pick up 3 PJs who had been left behind. And I'll be flat out honest with you. This is kind of the problem or the rub with studying air power or going to your local Barnes and Noble to find a book on air power. For lack of a better term, the sexy stuff, the bombing, the air to air, man, they get all the credit, right? It's much harder to find some good literature on air mobility out there, but enormously important.
Other questions?
I hope that was the question he asked, right? He did ask about air transport, right? I didn't just.
Was the war in Laos and to a lesser extent Cambodia driven by the CIA or the Air Force?
A little bit of both. All right. The CIA and one thing I didn't go into the discussion here, but is I definitely talk about the CIA was running all kinds of air operations and Air America operations in Laos and Cambodia. They worked very closely with the Air Force in setting up observation and listening posts. So what we typically refer to as the Lima sites along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And so that they both worked hand in hand. In fact, so you would have aircraft flying out of Thailand at Nakhon Phanom and then operating along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And so the Air Force and the CIA both worked very, very closely together. You can look at things like Operation Igloo, which is where we dropped listening devices along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But it was a little bit of both. And, if for reasons of secrecy or whatever, probably more so than the cargo crew guys. But there's still some literature out there on what the CIA did in Laos and Cambodia, but they worked very closely together.
Any other questions from the audience? Any questions from anyone on the Zoom call?
I hope so. There's a lot of stuff I didn't cover.
You mentioned the Geneva Convention did not allow jets in the earlier part of the war. Could you elaborate on that a little bit? Because that to me is amazing that we were, we did a lot of things that stymied us, but that just seems like it's an amazing one.
Yeah, let me, in fact, I will read you the stipulation there. Let me find. All right. The Geneva Accord specifically prohibited those type of weapons conducting operations in Vietnam. So this is literally from the Geneva Accords, Article 17, Section A. With effect from the date of entry into force to the present agreement, the introduction into Vietnam of any reinforcements in the form of all types of arms, munitions, and other war material, such as combat aircraft, naval craft, pieces of ordnance, jet engines, jet weapons, and armored vehicles is prohibited. But of course, after the Gulf of Tonkin, that goes right out the window.
Can I ask you about the numbers that you presented earlier? My name is Cliff Bernstein. You alluded to 922 aircraft that were lost during the period 64 to 70. What about the total war? Combat aircraft that were lost during the war.
Yep. Hang on, and I will tell you what the I got to keep a handy cheat sheet near me so that I can look this up.
Well, I thought it was interesting that 922 combat aircraft were lost in the first six years.
what you have to remember is that between 68 and 1971, with the end of Rolling Thunder and the beginning of the Vietnamization, we are not flying attack missions into North Vietnam. Now
Oh,
we're still bombing along Laos and Cambodia. And so those numbers are going to go up again in 71 and 72. But of course, necessity is the mother of invention. By the time we get to 71 and 72, our losses to things like SAMs and MiGs are going to go drastically down. We've got better friend or foe identicators. We no longer need to visually ID the MiGs, which means that our pilots have the ability to know it's a MiG and to shoot it from farther out. I think the total number is that we lose is along the area of 1,700 aircraft to all losses during the Vietnam conflict. And I'm trying to get
sure, just a
um,
ballpark figure is all I'm looking for.
so total aircraft losses is actually 2,255.
Wow.
Now that is for combat losses. I was right. It's 1,700.
Okay.
But then you've got other operational losses, accidents, and that type of thing. But
That's
we
that Air
lose.
Force? Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yep, that's just Air
Air
Force.
Force. So that doesn't include the Navy aircraft that were lost or the Army
Nope.
helicopters.
Yep, that is correct. And I mentioned that the Air Force built about 800 F-105s, and we lose right at 400 of those.
Wow. I believe
It's absolutely amazing.
well, I think I was in the Army in Vietnam, and seems to me it was right around 1,000 helicopters were lost during the war. Mostly,
And that'll go all the way back to 1961, 1962.
sure. And the Navy, I'm sure, lost. I would guess 500 or 600 aircraft during the war.
Yes,
A lot of aircraft. That's a lot of aircraft. Yeah.
it is. It is a lot of aircraft. It is a lot of men and material, and it's a lot of lives.
Yes. Very true.
We have a question from the audience.
Well, thank you for your service, Cliff. I appreciate you.
You're quite welcome. My pleasure.
Speak to the interagency politics, or I'm curious how the Air Force ended up with the caribous that the Army had up until about 64 or 5.
That's a good question. I don't have it here. I know I can tell you that a lot of what went on in the 1960s was McNamara and the Whiz Kids trying to get and look, this is not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not going to sit here and slag on McNamara. There's plenty of books that do that well enough. I'll give him credit for trying to get the services to work together and buy the same aircraft. It didn't really work then. I don't think it really works now. But I am not. There's a free book online that's done by the Air Force Historical Studies Office. If you literally just Google AFHSO, this will be the first thing, and they've got a free book online that's called Post World War II Bombers, and it will tell you everything you ever wanted to know about every bomber. They have a similar one for fighters, but it'll tell you how they got it, why they got it, and the number they got it. So that would be how I would point you in that direction to find that answer.
Thank you.
By the way, the same website, the Air Force Historical Studies Office. One of the principal ways I did research for this was by what was called the Chico reports, the contemporary historical evaluation, combat historical evaluation of contemporary operations. I think the Air Force did about 150 of these reports. They range from 15 pages to 250 pages. A lot of them you can find online now. But the Air Force took those reports and they wrote some really, really good books about the air war in Vietnam. Again, what makes theirs different from mine is that I wanted to cover everything in short pages, and they wanted to cover particular things in very, very long pages. But if you go to that Air Force Historical Studies Office and go to books, they have about a 7 or 8 volume set on air operations in Vietnam. That's a really, really good reads. You can buy them off Amazon, but you can get them for free on the website.
Do we have any other?
I'm always a fan of free books.
Excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
How many AC 47s were shot down or were in it? I mean, that's an excellent offensive weapon, but I don't know how many. Right.
We lose 17 AC 47s. We lose 2 AC 119s. And then much later in the war, we get the AC 130 and we lose 6 of those. So if you want to look at the gunships, we lose a little less than 30 of those total throughout the conflict.
Just before I got there, 2 of the AC 47s were shot down by my company. They were flying a interdiction mission, and the 50 caliber machine guns were going off. And one of the 50 round hit the lower aircraft, and it flipped into the upper aircraft, and they both went down.
Yeah, it's
coup. There was a play coup in about.
Yeah, this is why we take such pains. I mean, if there's any good thing that can be said of the Vietnam conflict, it's all the lessons that we learned. But this is why things like forward edge of the battle area, forward line of our own troops, airspeed or airspace deconfliction are so enormously important. You would tend to think that an Army unit firing on the ground would not worry about hitting our own aircraft, but it's very important that we deconflict those things.
Right. Exactly.
Do we have any further questions before we say thank you to our speaker this evening, because it was extremely interesting? Well, I'd like to give a big thank you.
Everyone wants to get home for baseball.
I'd like to say thank you to Dr. Laslie for this really interesting presentation. It made so much sense to me, and he answered so many questions that I've had over the course of the time that I've studied Vietnam. And we look forward to seeing each and every one of you, also, excuse me, all of our Zoom, sorry, frog in my throat there, all of our Zoom people in the future lectures. Next week, in person, we will have, the Marines in Vietnam. The following week, on October 25th, if all works out well, she will be here in person talking about the Navy in Vietnam. On November 1st, we have 2 Silver Star awardees coming in to talk about their service. November 8th, Ron Janowski will be here to talk about the role that the Hope Front played on how the country fought the war. And then the last on November 15th will be the outcomes of Vietnam. And one of the things that probably only brought up is logistics in terms of how we fly our planes, the airspace they're given, the areas that we're marking off. So many of those things will be key points in what we'll be talking about at those points. So I'd like to say thank you to everyone for coming tonight. We look forward to seeing you again next week. And good evening, everyone.